My name is Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. Welcome to Constituting America's annual scholastic study. This year's study is entitled The Genius of America, A Journey into Our Republic, a study on Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This essay is entitled De Tocqueville on the Distinctiveness of American Federalism, Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 8 of Democracy in America by Alexis De Tocqueville. Guest essayist, Joseph M. Knippenberg. De Tocqueville's discussion of, quote, what keeps the federal system from being within reach of all peoples, end quote, is a penetrating and challenging meditation on a certain kind of American exceptionalism. It is at once a tribute to the genius of the American founders and to the enlightenment of the people for whom they legislated, and a profound appreciation of the serendipitous contribution of geography, America's great distance from the European powers, to the success of their undertaking. De Tocqueville identifies two vices inherent in every federal system, quote, the complication of the means it employs, end quote, and, quote, the relative weakness, end quote, of the central, i.e. national, or as we say, federal government. The first, he says, is, quote, most visible, end quote, while the second is, quote, most fatal, end quote. The complexity has to do with the distribution of sovereignty between two levels of government, each operating directly on the people and each supreme within its limited sphere. This, de Tocqueville emphatically affirms, is, quote, conventional and artificial, end quote. That is, not natural. What's natural is for people to be governed by one source of power, to look to one capital as both the center of authority and the center of loyalty and affection. To undertake the careful discrimination between which government has authority to do what, to discern the limits of both state and federal government in their respective spheres, requires, quote, a people long habituated to directing its affairs by itself, and in which political science has descended to the last ranks of society, end quote. Are we still capable of this? Our tendency to expect or seek national uniformity in legislation and policy, our impatience with the political and cultural diversity of the states, and our complaints about the, quote, undemocratic, end quote, character of both the Senate and the Electoral College, certainly suggest that many of us have lost sight of the genius and subtlety of the original design. De Tocqueville's account of the weakness of the central government follows from what he believes about the naturalness of unitary government. Our national government is, he says, quote, a work of art, end quote, the product of our constitutional design. For most of us, most of the time, it is a remote abstraction. On the other hand, quote, the sovereignty of the states in a way envelops each citizen. It takes charge of guaranteeing his property, his freedom, his life. At every moment, it influences his well-being or his misery. Alexis de Tocqueville. Indeed, he continues, this sovereignty depends on, quote, all the things that render the instincts for one's native country so powerful in the heart of man, end quote. To be sure, especially in times of international crisis, we need a strong central government capable of defending us from adversaries. Our states by themselves are too small and too weak to meet the exigencies of such a moment. De Tocqueville describes an almost fateful choice between a weak government that leads to defeat and domination, and a strong government that prevails only by becoming despotic. It was America's great fortune, he wrote in 1835, to have the Atlantic Ocean between it and the European powers, a natural defensive barrier that remedied the defects of a relatively weak central government and obviated the need for a strong one. Now, we haven't enjoyed this luxury since the end of World War II and the beginning of the nuclear age. Despite America's status as a superpower, it remains vulnerable to other nuclear powers and to asymmetric threats, such as terrorism from rogue states and non-governmental actors like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. According to De Tocqueville's prescient analysis, such a situation would seem to call for a strong central government with its concurrent temptations to abuse and oppression, an example to despotism. We might then, in a sense, be forgiven for our own almost natural inclination to abandon federalism, paying attention to the federal government rather than to the states. But de Tocqueville's arguments suggest that we do so at our peril. As he argues elsewhere in Democracy in America, see, for example, Volume 1, Chapter 5 on townships and on administrative decentralization. The scope of local and state politics matches both our imaginations and our concrete interest. The more distant and abstract those interests are, as in national policy matters, the less efficacious and engaged we tend to be, and the more abstract and ideological our positions tend to be. It would not surprise de Tocqueville at all for a largely national political scene to be dominated by hyper-ideological elites, which seem like an apt description of our current situation. As I suggested at the outset, his remedy for this situation is to see to it that, quote, political science descends to the last ranks of society, end quote, so that we understand the vital role played by the states in our federal system. This is not just a matter of fidelity to a constitution that has been in place for almost 240 years, but of informed allegiance to a political arrangement that engages our interests, protects our rights, and provides the basis for the kinds of political interactions where fellow citizens on opposite sides of an issue can work together to find a common ground. This essay was written by Joseph M. Knippenberg. Joseph M. Knippenberg is professor of politics at Oglethorpe University in Brookhaven, Georgia, where he has taught since 1985.